Hi, so we're here today with Eddie Whittingham from, he's a student at Exeter University and also a supporter of Just Stop Oil. Hi, Eddie.
Hiya.
Hi. So Just Stop Oil has been in the news recently, targeting our industry in terms of action at museums. So I thought it'd be really interesting to speak to Eddie just to find out what their aims are and a little bit more about it. So Eddie, I think maybe it'd be really great if you could kick off by telling us who Just Stop Oil are and how did the organisation come into being?
So Just Stop Oil is an organisation made up of ordinary people demanding that the government ends all new fossil fuel licences in the UK. So what that means is no continued investment in oil, coal or gas infrastructure. So it doesn't mean, as we're sometimes accused of saying, that we should just stop overnight. Obviously that wouldn't work. Doesn't mean that you can't fill up your petrol car tomorrow. It doesn't mean that you can't, turn on your gas boiler at home. What it does mean is that the government needs to stop issuing new licenses for coal, oil and gas. And the reason that we're demanding that is that the climate crisis is, well, it's already here, but it's going to get worse and worse, right? So we've got the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's leading authority on climate change science, saying that we have a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. That was something they said in one of their most recent reports. Meanwhile, on fossil fuels specifically, we've got the International Energy Agency, the International Energy Agency, which is the world's leading authority on energy policy, basically. And they said in a 2021 landmark report, sort of net zero report, that any new fossil fuel projects beyond those committed as of 2021 are no longer needed, basically. So any and this is in line with their net zero pathway. So according to the world's leading authority on energy policy, any government, any corporation that is still investing in new fossil fuel projects as of last year, basically, or 2 years ago rather, is doing so against their recommendations, basically. So it's not like what we're demanding is radical. What we're demanding is what the world's leading institutions are asking for.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people think that what you're demanding is that everybody stops using oil instantly, and it's actually
that's not it. No, yeah,
absolutely. And what is the position with so for international audiences? But what's the position for the UK at the moment with that?
What's the position
with the licenses, isn't it? Or didn't?
Okay. So the government, as of unless anything's changed since I last checked, the government still has over 100 new fossil fuel projects in the pipeline. So these are licenses that are up for. I don't quite know how it works. I don't know if it's sort of bidding, like an auction style bidding, but essentially there are over 100 new licenses up for grabs in the UK. That's normally most significantly, that's drilling in the North Sea for oil and gas. But they did also approve a new coal mine. They also greenlit a new coal mine in Cumbria recently. Cumbria is in the north of Britain. So we're not getting the change that we need to see, right? And the UK government will often say, oh, the UK, we've cut our emissions by 50% since 1990, and we're only, 1% of the global, only 1% of global emissions comes from the UK. But it's not really the point, right? It's a case of, any injustice is terrible, right? Any injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, which is how Martin Luther King would have put it. So it's not a case of who's the biggest perpetrator, right? Who's got the most blood on their hands, who's got the biggest share of the blame. If the UK is not doing what it should be doing, if it's not saying we're going to lead the way and we're going to end all new fossil fuel licenses, and we're going to encourage other countries to do the same, then they are complicit. They are complicit in what's essentially a genocide project, which is continuing to put carbon in the atmosphere when we know that this is going to kill millions, if not billions of people.
Yeah. And I guess we lose our credibility on the world stage as well, don't we?
Yeah,
We can't tell
exactly.
it. Yeah.
So but yeah, you lose credibility, but also it's just immoral by any standard, right? To continue to invest in new fossil fuel projects in 2023.
Yeah. And can you tell me, so is Just Stop Oil, is it linked to Extinction Rebellion?
So we are a separate group, formally speaking, with our own sort of internal structure and our own strategy groups and all that. I mean, a lot of the people, I started off in Extinction Rebellion, for example, before moving to Just Stop Oil about a year ago. Also, a lot of the people that were behind some of the key strategic designs of Extinction Rebellion were also behind Just Stop Oil as well. So there's a man called Roger Hallam, who's probably the most notable example. He co-founded Extinction Rebellion and then went on to do the strategic design for Insulate Britain, which was if your listeners don't know, was a UK campaign trying to get the government to insulate all UK housing, starting with council housing, starting with housing that's affordable, basically for people in need. And they blocked motorways, and a lot of them ended up arrested and going to prison. And then Just Stop Oil came along about a year after that. So yes, certain people, they are separate things, but certain people move in the same circle.
Crossover of people then. And is it international as well? I know that your action is very focused on the UK, but I think there's other groups, aren't there?
So Just Stop Oil is a UK-based movement. However, we're part of something called the A22 network, which is sort of a collection of movements around the world. So who share basically a similar kind of philosophy and a similar sense of this is what needs to be done and we're going to do it. So probably the most notable example is Letzte Generation in Germany. That means last generation. So they've been making headlines in Germany and to some extent around the world as well, doing roadblocks basically, and they've achieved some success in doing that in terms of getting meetings with key figures in local and national government. Other movements are Declare Emergency in the United States. There's Renovate Switzerland. There's a not Paris, sorry, there's a French one that I can't remember the name of. There's one in Sweden, there's one in Australia, there's one in New Zealand. There's probably some others that I've missed as well. But yeah, we are a UK-based organisation, but we exist within a broader family of kind of quite radical direct action movements around the world.
Okay, and can you tell me about the funding of Just Stop Oil as well? So how does your action get funded?
Sure. So our main funder is something called the Climate Emergency Fund, which is an organisation that finances movements like this. Basically, that's why it exists, and that is funded. The Climate Emergency Fund is funded primarily by donations from wealthy patrons. So certain people in Hollywood have been kind of major contributors towards the Climate Emergency Fund's grant scheme. But we do also get donations from individuals as well. So just people that can donate an hour's wage a month or something like that. So it's a combination of those two things. So we've got a certain amount of income comes from personal donations, but we also get these grants from the Climate Emergency Fund as well.
Okay, great. That's really interesting to know. So moving on to some of your actions. So can you tell us about the journey of GSO's action, like where you've sort of started off and how we've got to the situation now where we have action at museums?
Well, that's quite a long story, so I'll try and keep it fairly brief. So Just Stop Oil launched in February last year. So that's February 2022. They kicked off with various cultural actions. So they disrupted the BAFTAs, for example. BAFTAs is like the British Oscars, for lack of a better term, where they basically sort of stormed onto the red carpet and hang banners from roofs and lit up flares and things like that. And they went on to disrupt football stadiums, basically, where people would run onto the football pitch and then try and sort of tie maybe their neck to the goalpost. in a way that's safe for them, but it's difficult to remove, basically, and so it stops the football game. And some of those were quite successful, and got millions of views in various forms around the world. We even got Gary Lineker to tentatively endorse what we were doing, which was brilliant. From there, we then had an extremely disruptive round of actions targeting oil infrastructure in the UK. So that was sort of April time, April 2022, and that essentially involved blocking oil tankers, climbing on top of oil tankers so that they can't move, blocking the entrances to oil terminals. I myself was part of an action where we essentially dug under a road leading into an oil refinery, meaning that the road had to be closed because it would be unsafe for tankers to drive across the road with people underneath. So and I can never remember the statistics off the top of my head, but there was a period where something like a third of petrol stations were running dry. I don't know if it's in the south of England or nationally. Again, I should probably know this, but essentially we did cause considerable disruption, leading to people needing to queue for petrol, basically. And that was with about 400 or so people taking action. So you think, what could we do with 4,000, 40,000 people? From then on, after that sort of month or so of actions, we went on to do cultural actions, more cultural actions, and those included probably what you're sort of thinking of, which is gluing our hands to the frames of paintings in art galleries. This was before the soup action. The soup action was in October, but yeah, I might as well jump straight ahead to that. Yeah, so we started off cultural actions in art galleries. At least they started off with people gluing their hands to the frames of paintings, so never damaging the painting, basically, potentially damaging the frame slightly, but that's I think most people would agree that's different from if we were to damage the actual canvas itself. The soup action, the famous soup action, done by Phoebe and Anna. So if your listeners and viewers don't know what this is, so basically the Sunflowers painting by Van Gogh is probably one of the top 5 most famous paintings in the UK. As in, if you ask any sort of person on the street, name me some famous paintings, they'd probably say, the Mona Lisa. They'd probably bring up some paintings by Monet, but the Sunflowers is extremely famous, basically. Like, most people will have at least seen it at some point in their lives. So that's kind of why it was chosen, because we correctly predicted that, I wasn't involved in the decision, but the movement correctly predicted that it would have a kind of outrageous response. If someone is seen to be throwing soup onto one of the most famous paintings in the country. So and it was, again, just to give a little disclaimer here, right, the painting itself was not damaged. It was protected by a Pyrex screen or a glass screen. But the effect that we had was what we were looking for, which is that it basically got something like, I think it's got something like 70 million views on Twitter, the original recording of the action. And in theory, I have to say that, caveat is in theory, that's 70 million conversations about the climate crisis that may not have taken place otherwise.
So I think that's interesting for me, just asking about that. So I guess your aims then, I'm interested in knowing what you consider to be a success. So your measure of success then is the views then, or whatever it measures, people having seen this action, and what you want from that is people to then be discussing or looking up why you're doing it, I guess. That's right?
That's part of it. I mean, obviously we won't have succeeded completely until we get a ban on all new fossil fuel licenses in the country, and we are willing to do whatever it takes non-violently to achieve that aim. But that being said, publicity is a huge part of that, because it's only when you cause, as I understand it, it's only when you cause disruption in a way that's quite, that's noticeable, impossible to ignore, that creates the publicity, and the publicity creates political pressure, and political pressure creates the opening for radical change to happen in a short period of time. So that's the kind of very, very, other people can explain it better than I can, but that's the sort of that's that's what we're trying to achieve, basically, is to create openings where rapid change can happen, basically, and the particular goal that we're pursuing is obviously a ban on all new fossil fuel licenses.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we actually, just for viewers, we're actually going to be speaking to Professor Colin Davis from Bristol about the psychology of radical action and how that does kind of move the conversation. But that's interesting to know that you have that in mind, I guess, when planning things, that it's actually, I mean, I guess I'm interested to know how you select your kind of action that you're taking. So with museums, I wondered if you were looking, if it was protesting about museums that were sponsored by oil companies, or is it that you're looking for like those, like you said, the Van Goghs, the kind of big news items, really?
Well, it's a bit of both, I guess. I mean, I haven't been involved in strategic design myself, so as I say, there's people in the movement that can explain this better than I can. But to give the amateur spiel, if you like, essentially, there are many campaigns that target, say, a museum for its oil sponsorship, right? So there's a campaign called BP or Not BP, who have done actions in the British Museum trying to get it to cut its ties with BP, with the oil company, but they tend not to work, right? Or they tend to work on a very, very long time scale. In other words, it might be a case of like they succeed after 5 or 10 years of trying. Basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get change as soon as possible. Basically, we're saying this is an emergency, and most people don't realize quite how serious it is, and the government is making it actively worse. And if we lived in a sane kind of civilized world, then we would be taking action that is proportionate with the scale of the threat that we're facing, but we're not. So that's why we're doing. So it's not really, to answer your question, it's not really about is this museum sponsored by oil company or not? That is an issue that's important, obviously, but the main thing is we need those kind of, I won't use strong language, but holy SH1T kind of moments. That's what we're pursuing with these culture actions. Like, they did what? Seriously? And it creates this debate, right? It creates this opening of like, well, which side are you on? Are you on the side of the supporters, or are you on the side of well, I would say the government. I mean, obviously, it's trickier with cultural actions, right? Because they're obviously they are independent from government, but essentially it does force people to ask these questions of like, what is more outrageous? Like, are you more outraged that somebody threw or appeared to throw soup onto a famous painting, or are you more outraged by the fact that we're literally making our planet uninhabitable? That's the kind of dilemma that don't know if dilemma is the right term, but that's the kind of question that we're trying to put to people, basically.
Yeah, sure. I think I mean, I think it's difficult. It has difficult questions, doesn't it? I think the Association of Art Museum Directors, I think they put out a statement saying that this kind of action is misguided because it's kind of putting at risk artworks, isn't it? So I guess it's a debate where you would draw the line, isn't it?
Just to say, Rachel, I do dispute that we've actively damaged any works of art. So I think that there's a couple of instances in which the frame might have had there might have been very minor damage to the frame, basically. So I glued my hand to, I superglued myself to the frame of Thompson's Aeolian harp in Manchester Art Gallery. And I think that the damage was assessed to be about £100 worth. But it's an instance of, if you went and you saw the painting and didn't know anything about, art and art maintenance and all that, would you even notice that my hand had ever been there in the first place? No, I don't think you would have. It's not like, the suffragettes, they literally took a knife to famous paintings in the National Gallery. They literally damaged the canvas. We haven't even gone that far. Right, the worst that we've done is extremely minor damage to a frame, basically. So that I think is a little bit different than actively vandalizing a work of art.
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate that you do research to make sure that any damage is minimized as well, at the very least. I guess just thinking about cultural institutions that maybe like the smaller ones, like the Action in Coventry as well, which maybe aren't as well funded. I suppose thinking of those kind of ongoing risks and costs that are associated with the action, like, you know, will bigger barriers be put up so people won't be able to get as close in future? You know, it's, I guess that is that kind of my thinking of, like, you know, there's a kind of, it's shocking, isn't it? But I think people who love art galleries and museums are particularly shocked because it feels like it's putting at risk what they stand for, I suppose.
Yeah, but the flip side of that is, you know, if you love your art, if you love your art galleries and you want them to continue, then you should be really terrified about the climate crisis, right? Yeah. Because, you know, what the climate crisis is going to bring is a future of basically mass crop failure, mass migration, extreme weather, you know, all manner of kind of heat and weather related death and disruption, you know, and all of the economic consequences that go with that, right? So it's a case of, you know, if you care about your institutions, right, not just art galleries, just anything that you love, you know, it depends upon us having a habitable climate system. It depends on us having, you know, a stable social order in which these institutions may exist, and climate change could take a hammer to that, basically. So yeah. That's why I would really encourage, you know, anyone who's listening to this or watching this is just like, again, what is more outrageous to you? You know, I'm not trying to be some sort of provocateur here. You know, what is more outrageous? Is it that we're disrupting art galleries and potentially, you know, giving them a headache, you know, potentially increasing their costs, or that, you know, we're still approving new fossil fuel projects, you know, in 2023, when all the scientists of the world are saying that's a death sentence?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was interested, and I don't know if you've seen this, we talked before, I don't know if you've seen the press release that was put out after the Coventry action just yesterday, but there was a call for everyone in arts, heritage and culture to join us in civil disobedience. So I guess I wonder, I think there'll be a lot of people within the museum community who would be very sympathetic towards your aims and what you're calling for. And I think also a lot of people watching are also sympathetic. So I suppose the question is, like, what would that look like if museums and cultural institutions joined you in civil disobedience? I think, you know, maybe there's an option to have them join together and not then have this kind of like people throwing soup at Van Goghs and things.
Yeah, well, needless to say, throwing soup at Van Gogh and any other actions will end as soon as the government ends all new fossil fuel licenses. Just want to make that absolutely clear.
Yeah.
I think the role. So there's sort of two things here. One is, what is the role of museums? Second, what is the role of just ordinary people, whether they're art fans or not. In terms of what museums can do, I mean, museums can issue public statements. They could issue public statements saying, okay, we don't like that we've been targeted by supporters of campaigns like Just Stop Oil. However, we acknowledge that the situation that we're in is absolutely desperate, and we call on the government to end all new fossil fuel licenses. That would be something meaningful that museums could do, right? In other words, like, you don't have to like us, you don't have to like what we're doing, but we all, you know, a habitable planet is in both of our interests, right? So there is a time where you have to kind of go against the grain as an institution and say the uncomfortable thing that needs to be said. So I would call on all art galleries everywhere to be in resistance, to be quite honest, to say, you know, we're not going to go along with a system that is literally killing us. And as for ordinary people, you know, lovers of art and non-lovers of art alike, obviously not everyone can be arrested or should be arrested. You know, some people do have sort of extreme responsibilities to young people or to old people, but or you know, they work in the NHS, they do things that they really can't risk a criminal record. But I mean, everyone can join us for slow marches, right? That's one practical thing, basically. So slow marching is where you walk very, very slowly along a road. Generally, it's at rush hour, basically, in order to cause disruption, but not be breaking the law. So that's something that we're pushing for in a big way. And Just Stop Oil at the moment is to get people to join us on the streets of London from sort of late April onwards. It could go on for many weeks depending on how many people we get. But they are entirely legal, so you can't be arrested. There's absolutely minimal risk of arrest, basically, because it is still legal. Basically, it's still legal to participate in a slow march. So yeah, that's just a couple of things. So yeah, museums need to come out in support of what we're doing, even if they don't like us personally what we're doing, and people should join us for slow marches in London. And you can go to juststopoil.org if you want to learn more. There's my plug.
That's fantastic. So yeah, because I'd seen that Extinction Rebellion have this year said that they're not going to have any sort of extreme protests, but they have called on people to come along to marches. Is that a similar sort of thing that you're looking at as well, or doing both?
So I mean, so just to reiterate, a slow march is a very, very particular a particular kind of thing. So you're talking about 20 people and then groups of 20 people on different roads, basically all basically. So it's maximum disruption from an action that is still technically legal. So that's a bit different than organising like a big rally on like a Saturday afternoon. Where you get tens or hundreds of thousands of people on the street, but it's all over by the end of the day. What we're going for is something much more targeted and much more sustained, basically. So it's not just we're all here together in solidarity, as we are still causing disruption. So that is a way that I think our strategy is different from Extinction Rebellion, who have moved away from public disruption as a form of action.
Okay, and I was just finally going to ask about you. So just on a personal note, why did you join Just Stop Oil, and how are you justifying the sort of potential effect on your future? Because I think you've been arrested 6 times, haven't you? How do you kind of deal with that, I suppose?
Yeah, so I've been arrested 6 times, and I was in prison for a week on remand. So the reason I joined Just Stop Oil is because, well, on a superficial level, I just want a livable future, and I think this is a way I can contribute towards that. But on a deeper level, I was sort of frustrated with some of the turns that environmental movements that I was part of before were taking. I didn't see them sort of as radical enough, and I actually do include Extinction Rebellion in this. They were the first group that I got involved with, and I wish them well, and I think what they're doing at the moment is great. And I will be there for the big one on April the 21st. Which I'd also encourage your listeners and viewers to go and join. That's Westminster on the 21st of April, and a few days after that as well. But essentially, I didn't see the kind of fear, the kind of panic. Even Greta Thunberg, says, I don't want your hope. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. I want you to act like the house is on fire, because it is. I'm just that's exactly my attitude, right? It's a case of, if we actually believed what the science was saying, would we be acting in the way we are? And the answer is no, of course not. We'd be shouting from the rooftops. We'd be filling the streets in our hundreds of thousands, and just like sitting in Parliament Square, sitting in Whitehall, day after day after day, week after week, month after month, and until we've got the emergency legislation that we need. The sort of World War II style mobilization. Because in World War II, everything changed more or less overnight, and that was for what's in, sorry to say, is actually quite a tame threat compared with what we're facing from the climate crisis. Right, we're talking about the collapse of our food system. We're talking about more than 1 billion climate change refugees by the year 2050, potentially. So if we actually believe that this was happening and we actually emotionally connected with it, how would we react? And I saw that in Just Stop Oil. I saw, here's a group of people who are willing to do what needs to be done.
Fantastic. I think we'll leave it there, Eddie, but that's fantastic. Thank you ever so much for your time. And it was really interesting talking to you.
Thanks ever so much, Rachel.
Hi, so I'm back today with Professor Colin Davis, who's Chair of Cognitive Psychology at the University of Bristol. And we're going to be talking about the psychology behind radical action, having already just seen our session with Eddie from Just Stop Oil. So thanks for joining us, Colin. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me.
So first of all, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your area of research. So I know you study the psychology of climate change as one of the things that you look at. And maybe something about how how climate change can be communicated and kind of what causes climate change apathy.
Yeah, my background is in cognitive psychology, so essentially trying to understand how the mind works. But over the last few years, I've shifted more to trying to think about the psychology related to climate change, as well as psychology related to behavior change more generally and to social change. And yes, climate communication is certainly one of the things I'm very interested in. I want to pick up on the last part of your question there about what causes climate apathy. This is a term that we see an awful lot. I've got books on my shelf over there about called climate apathy. But I'm very skeptical about the existence of such a thing. And I guess I would ask, well, what do we mean by climate apathy? Does it mean literally that people don't care about climate change? Because we know that's not true, right? I mean, if you look at recent surveys in places like the UK, there are organizations like YouGov every month are asking people what are the issues that are of most concern to you. And recently we had 40% of the population list the environment amongst their top 3 issues. We know from the very large international surveys of young people that 60% of young people are very or extremely worried about climate change. So, people do care. So we don't have climate apathy in that respect. Maybe what we mean by that is that, well, people aren't talking about climate change as much as perhaps they should. And there are various reasons why that might be. I think partly that's because it's seen as a scientific topic and people are quite concerned about maybe getting the science wrong and, embarrassing themselves or kind of making it seem like actually it's not a problem because they just don't understand it. Also, though, I think it's partly about emotion regulation. It is a scary subject, and so people are maybe trying not to think about it themselves and not to force others to think about it. And that obviously is a concern because it can lead to, if other people aren't talking about it, then that gives me the impression that other people don't care about it, perhaps. And so then we get in this kind of loop where I care about it and you care about it and my neighbor cares about it, but because none of us are talking about it, we all think that we don't care about it. Pluralistic ignorance is the name for that.
Right.
But to come back to your question, though, so how should we talk about climate and in a way that is kind of overcomes some of those barriers? I think the issue there is very much about not just telling people this is bad, we have a problem, but also being able to communicate that there is something that we can do about that. Not we, but you and I can do about that. So it's about communicating both the urgency of the situation, but also some kind of agency, some efficacy. So both that this is a problem that can be tackled, there are solutions, but also these are things that you can do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's the ability to take action as well, giving people the ability and knowledge about taking action. So I wanted to get, because we are an attractions conference, so it was really shocking to see. I think the other before Christmas, when soup was thrown over the Van Gogh painting in the National Gallery, and I remember seeing it and being utterly shocked about it. So that's one of the reasons we talked to Just Stop Oil earlier. But I was wondering about the psychology behind this kind of extreme activism, because it seems to me that, and I've seen lots of comments on social media, that it kind of outrages people. People are really negative about Just Stop Oil. They're saying they don't really understand what they want. So I wonder if this is really a good way of them taking action and achieving their aims, or if there's actual, well thought out psychology behind this. If it's not just that they're randomly doing these extreme acts.
Yeah, I mean, these actions are certainly not random. Activists do spend a lot of time thinking about what kinds of things they can do to try to help further their cause. I mean, in thinking about that, it's helpful if we try to put ourselves in the shoes, as it were, of the activists and think, well, what are the menu of options that are available to you if there is some issue that you're very concerned about, you want to bring about change? How do you do that? So, one thing you can do is more, as it were, normative kinds of protests, which might range from, having a petition, having a march, writing to your representatives and so on. Those are things that won't lead to that kind of outrage. They won't be perceived as radical. Those are the right ways to do it, right channels. There are also things that will be completely ignored. So, it's not that activists haven't tried those things. They have. They've just observed that they have no impact at all. And so then that puts activists in a kind of dilemma that you can do things that won't be disapproved of, but will be ignored. Or you can do these other things that won't get ignored. They will get your attention, but they will lead people to disapprove of you and your actions. And for groups like Just Stop Oil, this is seen as kind of the price of admission, as it were. Effectively, they say, well, okay, I'm willing to have people hate me, to have members of the public disapprove of me and think of me as immoral, because that will get attention and get people talking about the issue. Now, you'll often see claims, both in the public discourse and sometimes in the academic literature as well, that that's a bad strategy because it's counterproductive. That if I see someone doing something that I disapprove of, then I want to identify with them, and I want to support what that person wants. But I think we should be a little bit skeptical about that model of how change might work. I mean, if you think about, just think about yourself. Let's say that there's some issue that you feel quite strongly about, some contentious issue, maybe contentious now or in the past, about whether there should be, let's say, same-sex marriage, or whether abortion should be allowed, or your attitude to transphobia or whatever. If I'm an activist and I'm trying to get people talking about that issue, and I do something completely outrageous, or really morally bad, maybe I like assassinate someone or something, will you respond to that by saying, well, I used to be very much in favor of same-sex marriage or abortion or whatever, but now that person did that thing, and so now I don't think there should be same-sex. I mean, that would be a rather perverse kind of logic, I think. And indeed, when we try to look at this more carefully in scientific experiments, we find that isn't how people can process information. There's a clear dissociation between how people feel about the actions themselves and the people who do them, and how they feel about the issue. So I think we can be fairly confident about saying that that element of counterproductivity doesn't actually occur. And so it really is all about just getting people talking about the issue, getting it into the media, onto the front page of newspapers.
That's interesting. I think Eddie talks about when they devise their actions that they use, particularly Just Stop Oil, they use a few activists to create a big impact. So what they're looking for is this big impact to create change quickly, in opinion. So do you think that would seem to be, they seem to be doing that, don't they, effectively? I guess my point is that if you said Just Stop Oil, most people think that is actually about stopping us all using oil now, when actually they're talking about licenses in the future. So it's kind of quite a difficult thing, isn't it? I suppose, to get back to what was the question? I suppose the question is, do you think that what they're doing is effective, even if a lot of people don't bother to look at what they want and get the wrong impression of them? And I saw on Twitter, lots of people were tweeting like images of their kind of cars and gas guzzling cars back at Just Stop Oil, and I was it just seems like a very negative response to them. So I'm just wondering, I guess, do you think that they are actually achieving their aims with what they're doing?
I mean, I hate to be the kind of stereotypical scientist. I think the answer is we don't know. We have some interesting bits of evidence, but when you say, does it work? Well, it's not entirely clear. I mean, the case I was making before was that when people say it doesn't work for this reason, it's very unpopular. I think there's evidence against that. But it's a different thing to say, well, does it work? And then you have to ask, well, what does it mean to say it works? There are certainly some metrics on which you can say it does work. So if you look at the membership of Just Stop Oil and the number of visits to their website, the number of followers they have on social media and so on, then you always see big increases in those things after they take part in these kind of dramatic, high-profile actions. So, even if it's the case that many people might strongly disapprove of, let's say, throwing soup over a Van Gogh painting, nevertheless, that is a great way of finding those people who will approve. Not in the sense that they approve of apparently vandalizing a painting, but in the sense that they think something more urgent is required. They're so concerned about climate change, they want to do something. And they say, okay, here are some people who are doing something. So as a recruitment tool, it's very effective. It may also be effective even for more moderate organizations who wouldn't engage in such actions. So there's reasonably good evidence for what's called a radical flank effect, whereby you see a group like Just Stop Oil doing something that you think is outrageous, and you respond by giving a donation to Greenpeace, say. So it's like, I didn't care about this issue. I didn't like them, but suddenly this other group, who maybe in the past would have seemed a bit more kind of extreme, now they seem moderate, and I'm going to back them. We can also look at coverage in the media, and obviously Just Stop Oil have had a huge amount of coverage in the media, and you might say that a lot of that is negative, but nevertheless, some people will scratch the surface a little bit deeper, and they will find out that what Just Stop Oil means is that this group wants the government to stop issuing new licenses for oil and gas fields, which is, of course, not at all a radical demand. It's what climate scientists and the United Nations and the International Energy Agency say should have happened already. So some people will engage in that. And to take a different example, if we look at Insulate Britain, who people probably remember from a couple of years ago, who took part in similar kinds of tactics and blocking the M25 and so on, and that was also extremely unpopular. But if you measure the number of times the word insulation, not insulate as in Insulate Britain, but insulation was used in newspapers in the couple of months immediately after the start of those actions of sitting on the M25, then you see it doubles. So there were a lot of people talking about how they didn't like Insulate Britain, but also there were a lot of people who started to talk about home insulation. And people say, oh, actually, this is a good idea, isn't it? It would actually save a lot of money and reduce emissions and stop people from having to choose between heating and eating and so on. So although activists can't control what people think, they can influence what people are thinking about. So they can help to seed the news agenda.
That's really interesting. I think that's how I came across you. I saw an article you'd written, I think, about that. So I guess it's two things. I guess it promotes the kind of topic, doesn't it? And then also, like you say, this kind of radical flank then makes kind of other people look more reasonable, I guess, and other actions look more reasonable, which is really interesting. We had a comment on one of our LinkedIn posts when I advertised our Just Stop Oil session, and it was basically saying that this is like a bunch of students who don't know what they're doing. just kind of acting alone. The perception of just up oil is probably maybe incorrect then, isn't it? Because as I understand it, I guess there must be people within Just Stop Oil actually planning this action quite carefully and looking, I guess, at research like yours and understanding what's going on. So it's not just a group. These are not just groups of students who are acting on their own.
Yes, I mean, it's always interesting to see the way in which activists are represented. It's quite common to represent activists as belonging to some specific demographic category, although you'll see different categories mentioned at different times in different venues and different settings. So, sometimes it will be, it's these woke students. At other times, though, it will be ignorant yobs. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I think it seems to me like those are almost at the opposite end of an extreme. Or, it'll be these unemployed soap dodgers, or it'll be middle-class academics. And again, it's hard to reconcile those two things. Or it's, naive young people or senile retirees. And so, which is it? And when you scratch the surface, I think what you find is that it doesn't really matter which group it is. What's important about that discourse is these people are not like you and me. So that's what the Sun and the Mail and Express are communicating when they provide these kind of representations of activists. And I mean, I can't comment on specifically on what the person who made the comment you quoted was saying, but it seems to implicit to me that, again, it's like these people are not like me.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of othering of activists and, trying to sort of create division. But yes, of course, people are thinking very hard about the kinds of actions that they're taking, not least because, although, often the consequences of these actions are not often talked about in mainstream media, but people go to prison for this, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to go to prison, then you're probably going to spend just a little bit of time thinking about, is this really a good thing to do? To what extent is this likely to achieve my aims? And there are very long debates that go on in activist circles about this. Is this the right thing to do? Should we be targeting these people? Would this approach be better? It's a huge source of debate. And it's not that people are clear necessarily that they have the right strategy, but people feel that, well, we need to try this. And there's a great kind of tradition of experimentation amongst activists. So it's not something that is just done randomly. You see that, the choice of action is considered very carefully, the timing, location, and so on. So, there are theorists of social change working within and for these movements, certainly.
And just from our kind of industry, I wondered, it seems to me that the sunflowers were chosen, very specifically to create a huge kind of a stir, really, because it's such a well-known piece and it's such a shock to see them potentially being damaged, isn't it? So how do you think museums and galleries fit into this kind of this picture as a kind of a target for activism? Is it because we've got such emotional connections, I guess, and view? I guess it fits quite well, doesn't it? Museums fit quite well as a place where you're custodians of kind of, something of value for future generations, and these are potentially being damaged.
Well, that's a really interesting point that you bring up. That there is a connection there, which actually I haven't seen drawn out very often. So I'm really glad that you raised that. That museums and art galleries, they are a place where we collect what is dear to us, what represents our identity, our kind of cultural identity. And part of the shock and the outrage that we saw people experiencing when they initially thought that sunflowers had been damaged was that sense of we've lost something that is kind of central to our cultural identity. But if you listen to what the activists said at the time, I think the quote was something along the lines of, what is worth more, art or life. I think the rationale behind that wasn't trying to say that art is not worth a great deal, but isn't there something kind of curious about the fact that yes, we do have this very visceral reaction to seeing apparently a masterpiece being destroyed. Of course it wasn't, and yet perhaps we don't experience the same kind of reaction to a rainforest or a coral reef disappearing. Something else that you might think there was something kind of deeply kind of central to our identity. I mean, maybe that tells us something about how we've kind of lost our connectedness with nature to some extent. So yeah, I think there is something interesting about the action from that perspective. I mean, but of course, also to be more pragmatic about it. The other reason for targeting art galleries, museums, is that it gets a lot of publicity, and that is the currency that activists are interested in. And of course, there's also a kind of historical tradition there. So, I mean, you characterized this as very extreme activism, but of course, no artworks have been damaged, which is not the case for what happened with the suffragettes, who notoriously slashed the Rokeby Venus, and I believe there were many artworks that were damaged, some irreparably. So I'm not suggesting that's a good thing and that we should be celebrating that tradition, but it's good to take some historical context here. The other thing that was worth mentioning, of course, is that museums and maybe to a lesser extent art galleries have been the focus of some of these actions because they take sponsorship from the very companies, the fossil fuel companies that are giving rise to this problem. So when the Science Museum takes funding from, was it Shell? Can't exactly remember. Then scientists, activists go there and they say, this can't happen. So to some extent, museums, art galleries, they need to look to themselves to see why they might be the subject of some of these actions.
I think, to be fair, I think I did ask Eddie that, and he said that other groups, for Just Stop Oil, it's about the big headline. That's what they're interested in. It's not so much about the sponsorship, although there are other groups who kind of target because of that, I think. Yeah. So I wonder, we touched on it slightly, but what do you think the role of the media is in choosing what and how to report this? Because it is very interesting seeing who reports what and how it's referred to. Like, I've seen eco-zealots so far. And yeah, I mean, I think I was struck when I watched the reporting. I think it was an interview on Good Morning Britain. I think it's Richard Madeley who interviewed, I think it was, I can't remember her name, but a Just Stop Oil protester. And basically, it was very much like the scene from Don't Look Up. So do you think, what is the role of media? Are you surprised that sometimes the media don't necessarily do their homework about when they're talking to eco-zealots? Are they just looking, again, for ratings and to reaffirm people's opinions?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the role of the media is critical. They are the gatekeepers to that kind of attention that activists are looking for. And so activists are thinking very carefully about the media and about the kinds of things that will interest them. So that comes back to what I was saying before about thinking about the choice of action. One of the reasons that we've seen activists go into galleries recently is just for some of the novelty value. That isn't something that has been done so much in recent years, and so someone said, well, let's try that, and there is that kind of experimentation. First of all, they start gluing themselves to the wall and then to the canvas, and then, well, that's not really getting enough, so let's try throwing a can of soup at the painting. The news media thrives on novelty, and so once that becomes a bit passé, then activists will move on to something else. And a couple of days ago, when we're having this conversation, most recently, Just Stop Oil have targeted the World Snooker Championship. Is it World Snooker? Anyway, the target is snooker. And it's interesting to ask, well, why? why snooker? Because snooker fans will say, what's it got to us? We're not the ones causing climate change, which I guess is reasonable that they would respond in that way. And again, it's partly about, well, this is just a dramatic thing which will get attention. But I suspect, and I haven't spoken with the actors responsible, but it wouldn't surprise me if there is quite careful targeting of this group, because this is an event, kind of an aspect of culture, which I think is quite important for the readers of the publications that are most likely to want to talk about Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain and groups like that. If you look, which newspaper in the UK has mentioned Just Stop Oil the most? It's the Daily Express, I think, followed by the Daily Mail, and it is that kind of conversation, eco zealots, eco terrorists, woke mob, and so on. So it feeds in a certain kind of culture war that these papers they're interested in selling to their readers, and activists, I guess, saying, well, okay, well, if that's what's going to get us in the papers, then we'll do that. And again, timing is relevant there. I mean, they're doing that just before the so-called big one that's happening in a couple of days' time. Even location is something that actors will think about when they're thinking about the role of the media. So the locations that were focused on in 2019 for Extinction Rebellion's actions in London, Oxford Circus was useful because it was right next to the BBC. We know from academic research that the closer an action is to the news media outlet, the more likely it is to be covered by the news.
Oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting. I should actually say that the activist on the snooker table, that's actually Eddie, who we interviewed last week.
Right.
So now, and I had no idea.
I must take a look at that.
No, I had no idea that he was about to do that. He didn't mention it, so we couldn't ask him about it. But, he did say that we should record him last week because he might be around. So yeah. So I think we've talked a little bit about seeing public opinion shifting. I kind of understand a bit better now. So activists don't necessarily need for people to look at what they want or agree with them. It's all about kind of, there is a shift in public opinion just by getting publicity, and then also by being radical, that makes the centre ground, or what was the radical arm, then look much more kind of in the middle ground. Have you seen any evidence? I know you looked at that with Insulate Britain, but have you seen anything to do with policy making in terms of governments? Because something like new oil licenses, that needs to be a government decision, doesn't it? So how does that then, public opinion, then shift into policy making?
Yes, well, I mean, it's not clear as yet that Just Stop Oil have had any positive impact on governments' policies relating to oil and gas fields. Time will tell, I suppose. In the case of Insulate Britain, it is interesting to note that about a year ago now, so this would have been around 6 months after Insulate Britain started blocking motorways, it was reported in the Times and other newspapers that the government was launching a new policy, putting billions into this new policy of insulating homes. And that was matched by the opposition as well. It was also reported in this paper that at the meeting in 10 Downing Street, it was suggested that maybe they should call this new policy Insulate Britain. And someone had to point out that that name was already taken.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's politicians, they're influenced by the zeitgeist, by what's going on. And so they would hate, I'm sure, for there to be any kind of suggestion that they are somehow being steered by activists. They would resist that. But to the extent that there is this public conversation going on about, well, why don't we have more home insulation? Wouldn't that be a good solution? Then that is something that can influence policy. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a positive side. It should also be noted, however, that in some ways a clearer example of how these more extreme actions have influenced government policy is that we have seen the introduction of more repressive measures to deal with them. So the police and crime sentencing bill and the public order bill and so on. So, we now have these 10-year sentences for damaging a statue and so on. So that is potentially, a consequence of these actions that activists have to be very careful about. Again, there are very mixed feelings about that. So many people think, oh, well, that's really bad then. At the same time, there are other activists who work on a model of, well, actually, if it's clear the extent to which the actions that we engage in are costly and involve an element of sacrifice, then maybe that is a thing that will wake people up, as it were, and kind of arouse their moral conscience that here's, this pensioner being sent to prison for years because she's worried about her granddaughter's future. I mean, there are some historical examples that we can point to where that kind of mechanism of trying to, appeal to the empathy of the public can have an impact on bringing about change.
That's interesting. I've not heard that alternative point of view about this about the new legislation. The final point I was going to ask was, so we asked Eddie about whether there's a way, just in a very self-interested question, is there a way that museums, art galleries, heritage sites could work with Just Stop Oil to avoid protests? So how can we stop ourselves from being victims of protests? And he suggested that what Just Stop Oil want is not necessarily for people to say that they agree with Just Stop Oil, but they could say that they agree with their aims, but disagree with the manner of kind of protest. So do you think that's, what do you think about that? Is that a good way of protecting ourselves?
I think that's a reasonable thing for these institutions to say, but I would go a bit further than that. One of the demands of Extinction Rebellion, three demands. The first one was tell the truth. That is to have the government, but also important institutions, acknowledging the fact that we are in an emergency, and of course lots of institutions, including some museums, have declared an emergency, but you need to kind of follow that up with action as well. I talked before about how in climate communication it's really important not just to make people scared, not to make them think that we're doomed, but also to give people a sense that there is something we can do about it. Now, what is that thing that we can do about it? There is a danger here, and I think this is something that has caused activists to target museums in the past, that particularly if those museums are taking funding from Shell, Exxon, and so on, then they might have an exhibition that talks about the climate crisis, but then provide some kind of greenwashing solution. We're going to fix this with this new technology or whatever. If you listen to what scientists, climate science is saying, that's not feasible. We need to change our behavior, and that requires systemic change. So, what I would really like to see museums and galleries do is tell the truth in the sense of have exhibitions that are both about the climate crisis, because, it's important people are talking about that, thinking about that, but also about that element of efficacy and agency, and that show how citizens make change, not just on an individual level, but how they bring about societal change. And, if there are any curators or people from museums watching who are interested in that, I'd be very happy to talk to them about that.
Wonderful. That's really interesting. Thank you ever so much for your time, Colin. That was really, really fascinating, and I'm sure our audience will be really interested too, and hopefully you'll get some calls. Thank you.
Thank you.